Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Bethy Atkins, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's event with David Axelrod discussing his book, Believer, My 40 Years in Politics, in conversation with Harvard Kennedy School's David Gergen. Mr. Gergen is a professor of public service and director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. He has served as a White House advisor to 4 US presidents and currently appears frequently on CNN as a senior political advisor. Mr. Axelrod has managed strategy for more than 150 local, state, and national campaigns as a political consultant, most recently serving as senior strategist to President Obama's successful re-election campaign. Please join me in welcoming David Axelrod and David Gergen.
Thank you. Wow, good evening. Thank you for coming. We weren't sure with the ice and the snow, but obviously Boston strong still, and David Axelrod. David, we thank you so much for coming. I know you've had a hectic day. You've been over at the Institute of Politics, started his day at 8 o'clock this morning at breakfast at the Institute of Politics, and he has started an Institute of Politics, as you've heard, at the University of Chicago. So it's in his blood. He's written a book I've called Believer, My 40 Years in Politics. And I must say, David, I'm sure you've discovered in your early book tour, sometimes when you're being interviewed, the first question in your mind is, has this person read my book? And the second question is, has this person ever read any book? But I assure you
I have no such questions tonight.
I can assure you the audience out here, and we'll be going to you in a little while, are avid readers, and I know they're going to enjoy your book. I had a chance to review it for a review that's coming out Sunday, and I raised the question, could Barack Obama have been elected president without David Axelrod? And I know that may seem far-fetched in a way because, of course, President Obama is a prodigious talent. But it's also true that when they met, the prospects of him ever getting to the White House were quite slim. And what you piece together, and he'll be too shy or bashful to say this, but what you piece together, it was the coming together of President Obama with David Axelrod and the team that David organized around him, especially David Plouffe, that together they made it to the White House. And that leadership increasingly is less about an heroic individual and more about the quality of teams. And David Axelrod was the chief of the campaign team that came in with Barack Obama. So let's talk about your journey in politics.
No, I want you to keep on talking.
You've had about 150 campaigns?
Yeah.
Wow, think of that. And you're still a believer.
I really am a believer.
Tell us what it is, what you believe in.
I mean, as you know, that the book begins with a story about when I was 5 years old, and John F. Kennedy was campaigning for president in New York in 1960, October 27th, 1960, and it tells you how long ago it was because a Democrat was campaigning in New York City 10 days before the election, which would never happen today because New York was a battleground state then. But a woman named Jessie Berry, who helped raise me, really took care of me when my mother was at work, African-American woman, just full of wisdom and kindness, not highly educated, came up from the South, took care of other people's kids to take care of her own, came and she heard that JFK was coming to Stuyvesant Town, and where I grew up in New York City, she said, and she took me out there and put me on top of a mailbox, and I watched 20th Street, this big boulevard that's usually filled with cars, filling with people, and then I saw this charismatic young senator jump up there and speak, and it was, I was 5, I didn't quite understand everything he was saying, but I understood it was really important and exciting and electric. And years later, I went back and recovered the speech that he gave there. And he said, I'm not here on the platform that says if you elect me, everything will be good. He said being an American citizen in the 1960s is a hazardous occupation filled with challenge, but also hope. And we will decide on November, I believe it was 8th, which direction we'll take. And in a way that summarizes my feeling, because what he was saying is we have control over our destiny to some degree, and the decisions we make in elections and the people we elect and the direction we choose really can help shape the kind of future in which we live. I believe that, and I've seen it. And I have one of my favorite clients sitting over here, Governor Patrick, who is living proof of that. Living proof of that. Here was a guy who from the moment I met him, was just filled with a vision and idealism and a sense that we could do things that mattered together. And this state is a better state for the fact that he was here. So, you know, I've seen a lot of the good, the bad, and the ugly of politics. I've been disappointed at times by candidates. I've been disappointed by people who I had high hopes for. But in the main, I see evidence all the time. And, you know, the president himself, you hear a lot of discussion about, from some people about, well, he disappointment didn't, and for those who thought that, that the simple act of electing him was a panacea for every problem, I think there may have been some disappointment. But what I see is, I see a country that was in economic crisis when he got elected, that has come through that storm. I see, there were 2 wars raging when he got elected, 180,000 troops overseas. They've come home. I saw a healthcare system that was imploding and more people without insurance. And now we have health reform. The first 7 presidents tried to do it, 7 presidents failed, and he succeeded in doing it. It's work in progress, but it's progress for sure. Gay and lesbian Americans have rights they didn't have when he got there. We've taken big steps on climate change, have to take more. We've taken steps on immigration reform, have to take more. But there are a whole range of things on which we are in a better place because this man was elected president. And not just because he was elected president, but because a whole bunch of Americans, some of whom are probably in this room, organized on his behalf and on behalf of their shared values and the direction they wanted to choose for the country.
Yeah, I've written that I think you wrote perhaps the best case for the Obama presidency that I've seen. And you basically argue he's been the best president since FDR first 2 years, got more accomplished, with the possible exception of Lyndon Johnson on the domestic side. Help us understand what is that the message meister and a campaign strategist do in a campaign?
My candidates often ask me that. Look, I started as a journalist, and in a sense, part of the job, a big part of the job, is helping a candidate tell the story. Right. Tell the story of who they are, tell the story of where they want to lead, tell the story of what a campaign is about. And the real challenge of a campaign for a strategist, a message strategist, is to make sure that you are faithful to that story and that all the pieces fit together. One of the joys of working with Deval Patrick was that he had a sense of that narrative. He knew who he was and he knew where he wanted to lead, and he had a great sense of language, and it was a collaboration from the beginning. And the same was true with President Obama from the time I started working with him when he was a state senator running for the Senate.
Let's, Governor Patrick, I wonder if you could join us in the conversation just for a couple minutes and tell us what it was like to have David Axelrod as your campaign manager and as your message. But please stand, Governor, where everybody.
They're having withdrawal, Governor. They want to see you.
I am I just wanted to come and support my friend. I remember, David has a version of how we came to know each other, which has to do with his sister, which I didn't know at the time. But I came to know and work with David because Doug Rubin, who was our chief strategist, said it's time to get a message person, someone to help us with the media and all that stuff. And I'd never done anything like this before. I'd never run for anything before, so I didn't know anybody in that field. And he said, well, I think we should talk to these people, these people, these people, and also the guy who helped Senator Obama become a United States Senator. And I said, we can't ask him. I mean, that's a whole other orbit. And he said, no, we ought to ask. And I think Doug Rubin called you the same day your sister did.
Yes. It was. There's something bigger going on there. I think the same forces that made your January swearing in a 50-something degree day, so we didn't freeze because you insisted it would be outside. Were at play when my sister called me. My big sister Joan is sitting right there.
Please stand up, Joan. Please.
And Joan.
What did you see? What did you see in the relationship between the two? What was the potential here?
Careful on right here.
I live in Arlington. We had a group in Arlington who, one or two people in particular, who had identified Deval Patrick as someone who was unique and someone who could bring something to the governorship that was sorely needed. And I began working for him, and the more I got to know about him, the more he, to me, represented the kinds of candidates that David had worked for in the past, and what he believed in. And I called him up and I said, you got to see this guy.
Right. And she had never, ever done that before, so I knew she was serious about this. But, for me, so we sat down, and it took me about 10 seconds to figure out why my sister wanted me to meet him. And, at that time, the Beacon Hill, I was familiar with this pattern. The Beacon Hill wise guys were saying, they were ridiculing Deval for the silliness of wanting to go from town to town and group to group and actually interface with people instead of raising money to spend on television. And, he had all at that point in my career, I'd just done the Obama campaign, which really re-energized my idealism after I was becoming really depressed about the state of politics. So I was really hunting for candidates who gave me that same sense.
What I'm saying is that after my call, you said to me, I'm really busy.
Right.
You said that to us as well. Having done this, David, and I'll sit down. What was incredibly comforting to this first-time candidate was that David didn't tell me what to think or what to say, because I wasn't interested in that, and he didn't come to the assignment that way. He helped me understand where the hazards were, and he helped me think again about how to say what I wanted to say, but not what to say or what to have. And this whole idea of bringing your whole self to the campaign and your real self, this notion that the public understands authenticity. They're much smarter than you think is something that David Axelrod got about what we were trying to do from the start. And I'll never forget it. I'm grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you. So you had the Barack Obama Senate campaign in 2004, and then you had the Deval Patrick gubernatorial campaign 2006, and then you went back to another Obama campaign 2008. Was there a thread that ran through those?
Oh my goodness, it was a continuum. It was a continuum. I should go back up a little bit to talk a little bit, as I do in the book, about how I ended up connected with Barack Obama. You know, it actually goes back to 1992 when a friend of mine in Chicago named Betty Lou Saltzman, who's kind of a doyen of liberal politics there, called me and said, I just met the most remarkable young man I think you ought to meet. Barack had just come back from Harvard Law School, and I said, well, I'm happy to meet anybody you want to meet, Betty Lou, but why? She said, I think he's going to be the first black president of the United States. And so I always say that now when I go to the track, I take Betty Lou with me because she's so adroit at picking winners. And I met with Barack. We had lunch, and I, as I said in the book, I didn't walk away humming "Hail to the Chief," but he was clearly someone that I admired from the start, because my belief, and David Gergen has worked with many, many people in public life, I think the world of politics divides itself into two categories, and one's more numerous than the other. There are the people who run for public office because they want to be something, and then there's this smaller, more admirable category of people who run for office because they want to do something. And what was clear to me from the beginning was that Obama was somebody who clearly was in that second category. He had done very well here at Harvard. He was president of the Harvard Law Review. He could have written his ticket at any law firm or corporation in America and set himself for a life. And instead he came back to work on a voter registration drive in Chicago, to work at a small civil rights law firm. And it was clear he wanted to run for public office at some point, but that he wanted to do it because he saw it as a vehicle to make the community stronger, to make the country stronger, to make the world a little bit better. He saw it as a calling and not as a business. And I always, that struck me. But I didn't work with him directly for 10 years. He ran for the state senate in 1996. He ran an unsuccessful, and he made an impression right away there. He was as a freshman, he was chosen to help craft, the Democrats were in the minority, help craft the welfare reform law after it passed in Washington, and the state's version. And Illinois developed a more progressive approach to it, largely because of Barack Obama. He also passed the first ethics law in Illinois, a campaign finance law, in a very long time, and like a generation. And what it did, David, was it banned this practice that was this quaint practice in Illinois that allowed office holders to raise money and then keep it.
Right.
Keep it personally. If they paid taxes, they could keep it. And he helped lead the fight against that. I think the legislators thought of it as tipping, but some people thought of it as legalized bribery. So in 2002, we came together. He had lost a race, and he was basically on an up or out basis. He had one more race in him.
He was broke, too.
And he was broke. He was broke. He always tells a story about going to the Democratic convention in 2000 and having his credit card bounce at the counter for his rental car because he had plowed everything he had into this race. And he had promised Michelle that he had one more shot in him. And I was going through an existential crisis myself because I had a client in Illinois in the 90s whose name may be familiar to some of you, named Rod Blagojevich. And by the way, I always get the same reaction when I say that. But I helped him run for Congress, and I liked him, and he was pugnacious, and I thought he had a sense of identification with everyday people, working class people. His parents were steel worker and a CTA worker, and I liked him. But when he came and said he wanted to run for governor in 2001, I was kind of appalled, and I said, well, why? And he said, well, you can tell me why. You can help me figure that out. And I said, Rod, if you can't tell me why you want to be governor, then you shouldn't run for governor. And that was the end of our relationship, but he hired another firm, very proficient. They ran a state-of-the-art campaign, ran him, ironically, as a reformer, because the last governor also went to prison. We've got a few problems in the land of Lincoln. And so I was depressed about the state of politics because it was clear to me he was going to win, and that he probably shouldn't win. And I thought, geez, this level of cynicism is so great. Maybe I should find some other way to serve, to make an impact. And then Barack Obama called me and said, I'm running for the Senate. Or I'd like to run for the Senate. I'd like you to help me. And there were other people who were running who had more money. He was not he was a highly regarded person, not a highly regarded candidate. He had just lost and had no money, had no organization. And we hooked up around that because there were other better funded, better known candidates who tried to hire me. But I said to Susan, my wife, if I could help elect Barack to the United States Senate, that would be something that would really recharge my batteries, and I would be proud of it for the rest of my life. And we had a splendid campaign. You know, it was as inspiring, every bit as inspiring as that 2008 presidential campaign. So, you know, I was spoiled, basically. By the time I came to see Duvall, I was hunting for, you know, something as energizing and as idealistic as that, and I found it in him, and then that flowed right into it, and we learned things from each campaign.
What did you learn that
Well, I think one of the important things that we took from 2006 to 2008,
just from the
Duvall Patrick campaign into the Obama campaign, was had to do with social media. Duvall had attracted some of the really smart refugees from the Howard Dean presidential campaign, and Howard had Howard raised a lot of money online and did a lot of organizing online. Primitive by today's standards, what he did, but it was revolutionary at the time. Joe Trippi was his manager and had a great sense of that. And these guys took it another level in the Patrick campaign in terms of organizing online, raising money online, using social media, and we being liberals, we liberally stole all of those ideas and brought them to the Obama campaign. And David Plouffe in particular, who worked Duvall's campaign with me, spent a lot of time with those guys and learned a lot of lessons that gave us hope when we were 8 people in a room thinking about running for president and looking at what was masked on the other side. We had this notion that maybe we could use the internet to build the organization that we didn't have, that maybe there were millions of people out there who were interested in the kind of change that Barack Obama would bring, and that we could rally them, and that turned out to be true.
It was in that Senate campaign, the first Barack Obama campaign, that you had the advertising tagline, "Yes, we can."
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I gather that came very close not to appearing.
It did. You know, I loved it.
It was your line.
I wrote the ad. It was Barack's first ad. And what we wanted to do was tell his story and some of the barriers that he had broken down, and both in terms of his personal history, first black president of the Harvard Law Review, over single parent, and some of the obstacles he overcome, and also some of the legislative victories, improbable, that he had won. So I wrote this biographical ad, and it ended with, "And now they say we can't change Washington. I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message to say, yes, we can." And I loved it because it was we and not me. I loved it because it was positive and affirmative and filled with hope. And it said everything that I wanted to say. He got to the end of it at the first take, and he stopped and he said, "Yes, we can. Is that too corny?" And my heart stopped because I really loved it. And I made my case for why it was right and wasn't corny. And Michelle, who was rarely around that campaign, at the kids, she was working, and she just, and that was their understanding, that he would be running and she would do her thing. But she wanted to see him do his first ad. So she was sitting on a staircase. We were in a home. She was sitting on a staircase watching the shoot. And he turned to her and he said, "Mish, what do you think?" And she just, I'll never forget, she barely said anything. She just shook her head very slowly. She said, "Not corny." And he said, "Well, okay." And so, here I was, the professional, and he had some profound doubts about my insights, but when she gave it her blessing, he said, let's go. And I thought about it years later because I was watching some of the demonstrations in Tahrir Square, and there was a guy holding up a sign saying, yes, we can too. And I was thinking, what would that guy have had on his sign if she had said it was too corny?
Did you worry along in the 2008 campaign that your attempt to give people hope was also raising their expectations too high?
Well, yes. I mean, in a sense, it became a kind of like a runaway train in that regard. People were so hungry for change. He was such a refreshing candidate, so different than what they were accustomed to. And I think in some ways people assigned all their hopes and dreams that, they projected onto him everything they wanted him to be. And there was this sense that if he could win this and against these improbable odds, that anything was possible. And by the end of the campaign, we were seeing these crowds, 80 and 100,000. We also were becoming more and more aware of the economic catastrophe that we were riding into. And I remember, and I wrote about the president, Senator Obama, looking out the window at one of these crowds as we approached once and saying, it's going to be impossible to live up to these expectations. And everywhere he went, he was very careful to caution people that change was hard, change was going to involve struggle, that it wouldn't come easily. He talked about not being a perfect man and wouldn't be a perfect president, but he would always tell them the truth. I mean, he tried to add disclaimers, but it was,
You'd unleash something that you could.
It was like something I'd rarely seen. I talked to him at the beginning of the campaign. He was only he's 7 years old when Bobby Kennedy ran for president. I was a much older 13. And so I remembered all of it, and I actually was out working for him, and not as a strategist, though. But, and I said to Barack when he was thinking about the presidential campaign that what we needed to do was try and recreate the kind of idealism that I saw then. Bobby Kennedy stirred this tremendous sense of idealism. Eugene McCarthy ran that year, and there was some of that in his campaign as well. But there was this sense that we could change the world, that was what was at stake. And we wanted to create that sense because we wanted to challenge this sort of mind-numbing cynicism that said you really can't get anything done through the political process.
And so how do you explain to yourself now, I mean, you talked about the successes you've seen in the Obama presidency. Obviously, one of his greatest frustrations is he really hasn't been able to change the system.
Yeah.
And there's even, if anything, there's even deeper cynicism, and Congress is less respected. How do you explain to yourself in a candid way why that is?
Oh, you want a candid answer?
Yes.
Look, I wrote in the book, I think the fundamental truth is there's shared responsibilities, but most of what happened is that the irony of 2008 is that we preached the gospel of bipartisan cooperation, and it was such an appealing message that we swept in huge Democratic majorities. And I think that the Republican leadership, having been battered as badly as they were, Senator McConnell in particular, who is, as you know, an incredibly shrewd strategist, and said, you know what, and when we were sailing into this crisis, and I think that they made a judgment, and they've been very open about it, that they were going to let us fend with this ourselves. We had these big majorities, and you can see the political logic behind it, because we were going to have to make, and we made, a series of decisions that each of which were as unpopular as they were necessary to try and right the economy. The Recovery Act, which many people saw as profligate, the certainly the steps to right the financial industry, and then the decision to intervene to save the auto industry, which now seems like an obvious decision, but then was highly unpopular. And then the president added the decision to take on health care. And I think their notion was they were going to let us contend with this ourselves. And it was diabolically clever in two ways. One way is it preserved the option for them to attack the lack of progress, and it was going to take a long time for the economy to improve. So that was one element of it. But the other is they forced the president to govern on a much more partisan basis than he intended to, because the more that he couldn't get Republican votes, the more he turned to Democrats, and it fed on itself. Now, I'm also, in the interest of candor, I'm candid in the book about what I think his weaknesses are, because I think everyone's strengths are also their weaknesses. I think it's a tremendous strength of his that he doesn't think losing elections are the worst thing that can happen to you. In fact, the day after we passed the health care bill, he said, I was happier today, or I was happier last night than I was the night we won the election. And that's the way he thinks. We went to talk to the Congress about, to the Senate Democrat caucus about health care one day in the midst of that fight, and we're driving back to the White House, and he looked out the window. He was looking out the window. He was kind of quiet and pensive, and he said, what are they so afraid of? And I said, well, I think they're afraid of losing their jobs. And he said, well, what's the point of being up here for 30 years if you never do anything? And I said to him, I know you feel that way, but I think there are plenty of folks in that room who would love to do something good and positive. But if it's a choice between doing that, something positive, and being up here for 30 years, I think they'd opt for the 30 years because this is the best job they're ever going to have. And so there was always that disconnect. And as a result, there were times when I think he didn't reach out in the way politicians have to reach out to other politicians. He tended to moralize about the substance of the issue rather than identify with the concerns that the politicians had about it.
So a slight hint of moral superiority.
Yes, and I think that that's been a recurring problem in his dealings with politicians. All of that said, it is absolute mythology. It's just a complete fallacy, I think, to suggest that we were somehow, one Boehner-Obama golf game or one, McConnell-Obama bourbon or one big, love fest in the family theater away from peace and harmony in Washington. That just wasn't the case.
Yeah, but one has a very distinct sense that he loves to be out among the people. He loves campaigning. He loves to be out because he has a very high respect for the American people.
Yeah.
And one has a sense that he doesn't have such a high respect for many people in politics, perhaps because they're in that, he sees them in that first group.
I think it's fair to say, because most of the people who write and analyze are in Washington, there's a kind of meme that he doesn't like politics.
Yeah.
And as you point out, that's not true at all. I mean, he really loves going out. When in 2012, after we had a very tough 2011. 2012, I remember this bus tour in the summer of 2012 through Ohio, all these small towns, and he'd make speeches in these bucolic park. And he'd go into these town squares and go into diners and he'd go into saloons and he loved it. He loved it, but he doesn't love the politics of Washington.
And he doesn't like the politicians of Washington very much.
Well, they're a part of the politics of Washington. It's hard to love the politics of Washington and not deal with the politicians. But There is a smallness sometimes to the politics of Washington that he gets frustrated with and doesn't handle particularly well.
I get this question around the country a lot. Does he think the press has also become part of the problem and not part of the solution, that it's like enablers for dysfunctionality? It encourages sort of polarization, get the far ends of the spectrum to have food fights?
I think that there is, first of all, let me say, like every president I know of has always said, I don't read that stuff.
Yeah.
I never read that stuff. But then, you know, especially in the age of the iPad, of which he is an avid user, he had this amazing facility to be able to quote the most obscure columns in, you know, on the, you know, blogs that most people aren't even reading. So, I mean, I knew he did read this stuff.
Yeah.
I think that he has a high regard for journalists, you know, what he perceives the mission of journalists. What aggravates him, and I think it should aggravate everyone, is we're now in this sort of desperate competition for eyeballs. And as a result, you know, there is this frantic kind of exercise in which everything is elevated to the level of crisis and conflict, and in order to become, you know, more of a spectacle to draw people's attention. So, you know, what you find is that every day, you know, if you read sort of the basic coverage that comes out of Washington, and not just, you know, from the standard places, but all the places that now influence coverage, you know, it's like every day is election day. Every day is election day. Everything's about politics. Everything's passed through a political
Who's up and who's
prism.
down?
Who's
Who's
up
winning,
and
who's
who's up
losing?
and who's down. No one, you know, no one can ever propose anything because they think it might be a good idea. It's always how it will affect the next election or how they want to jam the other party. You know, Freud once said sometimes a cigar is just a good cigar. Never in Washington. In Washington, there's always a different meaning. And I think he gets frustrated with that. And we said, look, what happens is these stories kind of unfold that hijack the whole dialogue for weeks at a time. You know, when I was in the White House, I wrote about this. We had the oil leak in the Gulf, and you'll all remember that the stories then were, this is Obama's Katrina, you know, this is going to define his presidency. Well, you know, we solved it. We solved it, by the way, in part, I was walking, you know, there's this deli, Ike's, in the basement of the old executive office building. I went over there for lunch one day, and I saw sitting at a table Stephen Chu, the energy secretary, all by himself, and he was like doodling on a napkin. I said, Steve, what are you doing here? He said, and he was a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He said, I think I figured out how to stop this oil leak. And he holds up this napkin and he's starting to explain it to me. I said, man, I barely passed physics in high school. You better go find somebody who knows what this means. And it turned out that was he fashioned the solution. What was on that napkin ended up being the solution to the problem, or a big part of it. But we stopped it, and you know, David, in 2012, I think if you look through all the record of the campaign, not once was the leak in the Gulf mentioned. And you know, we saw a recent example of this on Ebola. You know, I was on a TV show shortly after the Ebola outbreak, and the case was diagnosed here, and I was on with one of the people, Joe Scarborough, my friend from Morning Joe, and Dr. Frieden from the CDC was on first, and he said, you know, he said, we are going to be able to control this here. I don't expect a major outbreak here. Joe was incredulous, said, I don't think they're telling the truth. Much more dangerous than people are being told. It was kind of an anti-government thing, I think. And I said, well, I don't want to argue with Dr. Scarborough, which really aggravated him. And, but I said at that time, I think we're going to look back at this in a couple of months, and we're going to say, what was that all about? Yeah. It was leading the news every night for weeks, you know, and whipping people into a frenzy. And in fact, it wasn't a matter of months, it was a matter of weeks. That's what frustrates him, because you want to deliver a message about something that's really substantive and important, and instead you've got to navigate your way through these kind of faux stories that become, you know, a thing in the media, sometimes for weeks at a time.
It's really interesting. I want to make sure we have time to get to the floor.
I'm conspiring against you.
We've talked about a lot of things like money, influence of money, but I have one more question for you, and then let's go. And that is, as you've been out on tour with your book, a number of people have been asking you about Hillary Clinton and your advice if you were going to be her her strategist for the campaign ahead, the possible campaign ahead.
I think it seems like a likely campaign ahead.
Likely campaign ahead.
Yeah, well, look, first of all, everybody, always asked me that as, someone who ran a campaign against Hillary Clinton. I never really thought of myself as running a campaign against Hillary Clinton. I ran a campaign for Barack Obama. And obviously we tussled and we were, and it was predicated on the notion that she wasn't the right candidate for 2008. But I had worked for her when she ran for the Senate in 2000. She was, and I've known the Clintons since the early 90s. And she was she is one of the patron saints of CURE, Citizens United for Research in Epilepsy, the foundation my wife started because of my daughter's battle with epilepsy. So I really, I've had a long relationship with her and mostly a positive one. What I would observe from 2008 was that she was a very bad candidate in 2007. She was a bad candidate because she was cloaked in this presumption of inevitability and sort of strangled in it, I thought, and very cautious and unwilling to be venturesome and to connect and so on. After she lost the Iowa caucuses, she was a different candidate. And we saw it up in New Hampshire, much to my chagrin. I mean, she was connecting and she was visceral. She was in touch with people's struggles and she was willing to be revealing of her own. And she was, in other words, authentic in a way she hadn't been. And she was, and that caution was thrown off. The second thing is that the mistake that was made in 2008 or 2007, that period, was the candidacy got out in front of the rationale for it. There was this sense that she was going to be a candidate and she was probably going to be the nominee, but nobody really knew why she was running. And that was a mistake. I think she started fleshing that out in 2008, but it was too late. I also think that the Iraq issue being as dominant as it was in 2008 was also a huge problem for her.
Her husband ran with a campaign with a theme song of "Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow."
Yes.
And she's very identified with yesterday. How does she make a campaign?
Which is also
tomorrow?
A good song, by the way.
What's that?
It's also a good song.
Yeah.
But
how does she make a campaign about tomorrow?
I think that's the point, that she has to come out of the gates with a vision about where she wants to lead this country. Bill Clinton did say every campaign is about the future, it's not about the past. I think it was a great insight, and that is true. I don't think, though, that means that if your name is Clinton or even if your name is Bush, that you're disqualified from offering a vision for the future that people find compelling. And I think if you do, then the issue of your name and your past, your long history becomes less important. There's a fundamental struggle in our economy and all advanced economies today about whether or not the middle class will survive, whether or not people who work hard can get ahead, whether there's going to be economic mobility, or whether you're doomed to live and die within the class in which you're born, and of course inequality. And there are strategies that we can employ and have to if we're going to break that and sort of recapture the value that we all identify as an American value, that we do honor hard work, and this is a country where you can go as far as your work and talents will take you, and that everybody will get a fair shake. I mean, it's not an ideal we've ever fully honored, but it's an ideal that we believe in, and it's really important. I think she needs to come out and speak to that. And I sense she made a great speech in the midterm elections up in Pennsylvania. She was campaigning for Tom Wolfe, who was running for governor, in which she talked about that. And she talked about it in the context of her own upbringing and her own middle-class family in a very authentic way. And so I saw glimpses of what could be. And I think she's taken her time and thinking that through. Other thing I want to say about her candidacy now as opposed to then. At that time, people were really hungry for a candidate who would challenge in a big way the politics of Washington. And as you point out, we have been not all that successful in that venture. We've been successful in achieving big goals, which was the fundamental reason why you wanted to improve the politics of Washington. You wanted to improve it not for style points, but because you wanted to remove barriers to achieving big things. I think he has achieved big things. We have under Barack Obama, but we didn't achieve that. I think that this election is going to be defined by that, because as I've always said, people look for the remedy to what they just had, whether they like the president or not the replica of what they just had. I think they're going to be looking for someone who they think can manage the system, navigate the system. And in that sense, this is a much better environment for a Hillary Clinton to run.
Fascinating. Questions? Yes, please. Please stand up.
Hi, how you doing?
Very well. I was in Unity, New Hampshire when both both senators came to unify in 08.
Oh, yes.
Was great.
Unity, New Hampshire.
In Unity, New Hampshire. So I like the point that you made about Congress and, doing 30 years and not accomplishing anything, meanwhile collecting a paycheck and a benefit package and health insurance and things like that. My concern today is Citizens United and campaign reform and the cost of campaign. And when I look at now, we're talking $1 billion, and I think, and voting, changing laws, the voting, I feel like us, the little people, I guess I'd still vote. I encourage my students to vote. I teach at a community college in New Hampshire. But the money in politics, I'm just afraid that the little voice is getting washed out because of the big money.
Well, let me just say that thank you for your question. The great thing about, I share your concern completely, but, I've said, and I've been saying for years, that we were on the cusp of, now we're in the throes of a new Gilded Age. And in a sense, there is a great historical parallel, because after the in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, there was this aggregation of great wealth, and there were oligarchs who were very powerful in American politics and who leveraged a lot of money in our campaigns, and that gave rise to Teddy Roosevelt in the progressive era, and the country pushed back. I think we're in the same kind of period. I think we also are going to see a pushback on some of that. But I would really hope that you urge your students to not to avert their eyes, but to jump in, because there is one day every couple of years when everybody is the same, whether you're a gazillionaire or a pauper. And that's the day, assuming that you're a pauper who's allowed to vote, which is another issue. And that's the great leavener. And so if we're going to have a new progressive era, it's going to have to come because lots of people are disgusted by what they see and want to change direction on some of this. So what we need are people to respond to this by getting more energized and active, not by becoming so discouraged that they walk away. Now, on the issue of Citizens United, look, it bothers me that we have oligarchs who now have basically displaced parties as the principal funder of campaigns. It bothers me more that a lot of this money is undisclosed, and that because of loopholes, you see, I believe in campaign finance reform. I think that it's good, the impulse to try and control money in politics is right. The problem is we've been doing that for some time, and what we've done is basically created a system for cottage industry for lawyers to find ways to circumvent the system. So we haven't exactly cleaned the system up, but we've made it a lot sneakier. And so the first thing we have to do is make sure that every dollar that's spent in campaigns, whether it's by third parties or by candidates, is fully disclosed, and with major penalties for people who don't. So at least we know where all this money is coming from. Now, one last point. We in the Obama campaign have to accept some responsibility for the proliferation of money in politics, because we made a decision in 2007 or 2008 to forego the campaign finance structure, to work outside of the structure, not accept public financing in exchange for a lack of limits on what we could spend. And we ended up spending $800 million in that campaign, and I don't think anybody will ever go back in that system again. We did it because we were worried about third parties like the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth, who had done such damage to John Kerry, and we want to make sure we had the resources to deal with that. But, you know, we also contributed to this proliferation of money that is unhealthy. So we've got issues that we have to tackle here.
Mr. Axelrod, you've worked with some great candidates that have terrific victories. You've also worked with a few people that haven't won. I'm just thinking about Senator Simon, a very distinguished senator who ran for president, or Senator Edwards, an interesting person that also ran for president. I'm wondering if you could just reflect on a few of the people you've worked with that had a lot of talent, but just for whatever reason did not win. What did you learn from those experiences? Those are two distinctly different cases. Those were the two other presidential campaigns that I worked on as a strategist. Paul Simon was my client in Illinois. He was the guy who got me out of the newspaper business. I was a newspaper man. He offered me a job. I was getting dismayed about the direction of my newspaper. I saw the leading edge of what we see today, sort of the corporatization of journalism in a way that I found discouraging, and he came along. In a weak moment, I decided to jump to what my colleagues at the newspaper called the dark side. But Paul was a great guy. He was he was like the Orville Redenbacher of Illinois politics. You know, big horn-rimmed glasses and bow tie, and really an earnest guy and a great story. Courageous guy, fought for civil rights from deep southern Illinois, to his own detriment, fought for political reform in Illinois in the 1950s, which was almost a dangerous thing to do. And so I really liked him. I knew he would never embarrass me. Went to work for him. We won this improbable victory for the U.S. Senate. I ended up as his campaign manager right out of the newspaper business, which was kind of a crazy deal. And then I started this firm. And then 2 years later, he decided to run for president. And I was reluctant about that because I worried that he was going to jeopardize his Senate seat. And I didn't know how Paul would play as a potential president. He wasn't from central casting at all. And, in that campaign, by the way, the tagline of our ads in that campaign was, "Isn't it time to believe again?" So there's a motif here. But I always thought, Paul was just not the commanding sort of figure that people, identify with the presidency. And we ended up losing the Iowa caucuses narrowly. That was one thing. In 2004, I signed up with John Edwards after a 2-hour meeting. He had lost his consultants who went to work for John Kerry, and he was looking for a media consultant. And he asked me to come to Washington. People had warned me not to jump too quickly, but I was a little too eager to be involved in the race. I thought a good populist candidacy could beat George Bush in 2004. Edwards had this profile. I met with him. I liked him. He certainly seemed skilled, and certainly seemed committed to a kind of populist argument. There were things, and I won't go into detail here, in that first meeting with him and his wife Elizabeth that should have been warning signs to me. And my wife, I recounted the trip to see him to my wife, and she told me I shouldn't do the race, and I should have listened to her. And it turned out not to be a very happy experience. And what I learned from that was, and it didn't in part because John Edwards was a very talented guy, but I learned over time that he was, I was working for Barack Obama at the same time I was running for the Senate. It was interesting, the contrast. Barack wanted to drill 2, 3, and 4 levels deep on issues and think them through. And John really wanted the cliff notes. He wanted to know what he had to say in order to get to the next level. And it was there were a lot of problems, and it was a very discouraging campaign. And that's why when 2008 was coming up, I had 4 candidates before Obama, including Hillary, who were former clients of mine running, and I decided I wasn't going to be involved, because I thought to myself after 2004, I was never going to work for someone for president of the United States again unless I was so close to them and had such faith in them and had such a bond of trust that I wouldn't be fooled, nor would the vicissitudes of campaigns split us apart. And then Obama ran. And you know, I learned a lot of lessons in 2004 from Edwards, and that made the Obama campaign even more enjoyable and special to me.
Thank you. We're going to try to get through all these questions, but we'll definitely end by the last person now standing, please.
Okay.
I'm a former Illinois resident, and I was in Grant Park the night that Barack was elected, and it was a highlight of my life. Thank you for your part in that.
Yeah, mine too. One of them.
Yeah. I've been knocking on doors and manning phone banks going back to the Eugene McCarthy campaign. And it seems to me that political parties are so last century now. And I wonder how you see the role of the political parties in general in this century.
You know, I think that, there has been an erosion of political parties, and you and I were both probably a part of that, because the McCarthy campaign, the McGovern campaign in 1972 and so on, were you know, a direct challenge to sort of the old party bosses and party leaders and party structure, more of an emphasis on direct selection of candidates through the primary process. And I was all for that, because, you know, bossism seemed ugly and coercive, and like a lot of things, I think it's more nuanced now. I kind of, you know, I'm not sorry that we don't have political bosses, sort of corrupt political bosses dictating all the decisions in parties. On the other hand, those corrupt political bosses produce some pretty incredible candidates over time. Franklin Roosevelt, and, you know, Jack Kennedy, you know, was, you could argue that Richard J. Daley was very instrumental in his ascension to the presidency. You know, in my state, Adlai Stevenson and Paul Douglas were the products, or at least supported by and moved along by the Chicago Democratic machine. But parties stood for something. And because there was a party structure, you know, people say, why can't it be like when Lyndon Johnson was president, Jack Kennedy was, you know, Jack Kennedy could pick up the phone and call Richard J. Daley and say, Roland Libinati is giving us trouble on the Civil Rights Act, and I really need his vote. And Richard J. Daley would say, as he did on tape, he'll vote for any goddamn thing you want. I probably shouldn't say that in a church.
It's okay, it's Unitarian.
And you know, parties stood for something. There was some order to that, you know, and there's something that I kind of miss about that. But having said all that, what is the role of parties in the 21st century? I think one of the things that the Republican Party has done well through its various structures, and the oligarchs, by the way, is they've done a very good job at organizing at the grassroots for local elections and legislative elections, and that's why they've taken over so many, part of the reason why they've taken over so many legislatures, and they've got a better bench than the Democratic Party, which has been a top-down party. I think Howard Dean had the right idea when he was chairman of the party, and he had a 50-state strategy. I think the role of the party, at least the national party, ought to be to support the organizing efforts of local parties. These state elections are very important. They're like an incubator for ideas. The Republicans have figured that out. And I would love to see the party apparatus really focused on recruiting really good candidates for legislature, for city councils, for down ballot offices, and developing the talent that will become governors and senators and you know, office holders at higher levels. In the same vein, you know, I'm kind of ashamed of the fact that we, the Democratic Party, claim to be the party of diversity, and yet we do very little to promote candidates, diverse candidates, or diversity among our candidates. We should be out promoting and encouraging young African-American candidates and Hispanic candidates and helping them. Oftentimes they need the technical help that is hard to buy and doesn't, you know, so that we have African-American governors and Hispanic governors and senators. I mean, the Republican Party has several Hispanic governors. They've got more Hispanic senators. They've got, you know, I mean, so I think the party can play a positive role in all those ways, and I kind of urged that when I was there, and I didn't get very far. But I think that's what parties can do.
Thank you.
Mr. Axelrod, I want to thank you for coming in here tonight.
Thank you.
And I actually wanted to ask you, when you look back and you see President Barack Obama's relationship with Ted Kennedy, do you think President Kennedy, Ted Kennedy's brother, had any influence over Barack Obama, or did President Obama ever look back and say, oh, President Kennedy did this, I should follow his lead, and whatever it may be?
Well, I think he would say that President Kennedy, by being an advocate for programs that brought people from overseas here to study, was affected his life in a big way. But he was really quite young when the Kennedys were alive and active. But let me just say one thing about Ted Kennedy, who I think was really one of the great Americans of my lifetime. I don't know whether he would have alone made the difference in terms of changing our ability to work across party lines, but he was a guy who was revered on both sides of the aisle in the Senate, a politician in the best sense of the word, used those relationships to do things to advance the country, understood how to build compromise, and his support for Senator Obama for president was one of the most important developments in the president's campaign, and his illness and his death was one of the most devastating blows to our ability to do some of the things that we wanted to do. And I think the Senate was greatly reduced by his absence, and that loss is still felt.
Thank you, sir.
Hi. It's very clear, obviously, from the title of your book and from everything you say and from your career that you are both an idealist and a real believer in government. And I think a lot of us who have supported President Obama are in the same way. But there's also, it's become very clear to me that there's a very large share of the American population that doesn't believe in government, that is actually deeply cynical and afraid of government, and that just kind of wants to be left alone and sees this hopey, changey thing as a bad thing. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how you break through to them and how you make them not have that sense that government is the enemy.
Well, first of all, there's been a persistent, since the Reagan years, Reagan ran against sort of a government as a kind of hidebound instrument, and government had, was in need of updating after 40 years, but it became sort of dogma to dismiss government. I think Reagan governed a little bit differently in some ways in terms of the deal making he was willing to do, understood that there were functions that were necessary. David can speak to this more readily than I. But what we've seen in the last many years is something more virulent. We've gone from small government conservatives to no government conservatives, and that's really dangerous. But I believe in the cyclical nature of American politics, and I just have this instinct that we're on the cusp of a turn. And by the way, I don't think that the argument is more government or less government, but how do we solve problems? And sometimes government has to be the instrument for that, and sometimes there are other instruments for it where we, through government and through politics, can catalyze that change. So I get a little uncomfortable with the big government, small government argument, and I'd like to be smart about this and say, how do we maximize our ability to solve problems, to clear barriers out of people's way. One of the things that I always talk about, and I tried to get into as many of the president's speeches as I could. I mean, you know, not surprisingly, the president he reveres the most is Abraham Lincoln. And we all remember Lincoln for leading us through the war and the great emancipator and so on. But to me, one of the things that is so special about Lincoln was that in the midst of the Civil War, that he also laid the groundwork for the Transcontinental Railroad, because he knew that if America was going to grow, that we needed to connect the country. He signed the Morrill Act for land-grant colleges because he felt that education was going to be really important for people to realize their full potential. He started the National Science Foundation because he thought science was going to be so important for our future development, all during the Civil War. And, you know, you can be sort of glib about it and saying he was the founder of the Republican Party. Obviously, we're different times, but the theory is right, which is there are certain things, as Lincoln said, that we can only do together. You know, we're having this debate now. I think it's absolutely criminal that with the lowest interest rates in history, we continue to let our infrastructure run down, and we're not investing massively in a 21st century infrastructure that would put people to work. Now, is that big government? I don't know. I mean, that would be what the opponents would argue. I think Americans may respond to a different argument. Research and development is obviously a key to innovation, and sometimes only the government can do. You know, you guys, there are probably a lot of scientists here or people who are hang with them. Know that unless you do basic research, you know, industry isn't going to fund some of this basic research that doesn't have immediate application. Government has to do that. And of course, education and training. You know, we ought to be committed to the notion that every single person in this country is trained to the best of their ability, educated to the best of their ability, because that's going to help in terms of their own advancement and help deal with this inequality issue. But also it's going to make our economy stronger, and it's going to make America more competitive. You know, that's not, to me, that's not an argument about more government or less government. That's an argument about what strategy do we have to deal with these big problems. So I think people are receptive to those arguments. And then I think we as people who have a progressive bent need also to recognize that sometimes government tries things and fails. Sometimes bureaucracy needs to be updated. Sometimes bureaucracy is no longer necessary in an age when we have so much more capacity through technology to solve problems. You know, I talk to these young kids, and they're so, one of the reasons they're alienated from government is because they think that if you have a problem, government's very slow and tied down in politics, and you got a problem, well, go start an app, you know. Well, government could learn something from these kids as well. So, I mean, we ought to be open to the knowledge that just because we've done things some way in the past doesn't mean that's the way we should do it in the future. But we should never yield on the point that there are big problems that we need to organize ourselves to solve. And this notion that we can walk away, the no government conservatism, is a death wish for this country in terms of our competitiveness, our social fabric. And I think increasingly people are going to recognize that. So, but that's the optimist in me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about a point that you touched on briefly, where you said that the big challenge when you're developing a message, developing a story, and then attempting to extend it through different target audiences and all, is that sometimes the media is casting out, I think you used the term faux stories, that distract from that central narrative for a candidate or a campaign. And I'm curious what you see as the other big challenges to developing or extending a campaign's message. Is it...
Let me just say that I think that the problem... I'm sorry, I didn't let you finish your question.
Well, I guess I was just wondering, social media, obviously, little things can start as sparks there and then spread like wildfire. Sometimes the challenges, though, are coming from within a team if they don't all understand the same kind of editorial principles and the big themes. So how do you handle all that?
I think that it's easier to control the environment in campaigns, because you don't have to talk about things you don't want to talk about generally. You can talk about just a few things. You have paid media, so you can do advertising that sends a signal as to what you're trying to communicate. It's harder in governing because you can't sort of pick and choose. Things come your way, you have to respond to them. And that's where my frustration really came in. And in terms of, and so with all this maelstrom all the time, it's very hard to drive a consistent message. One of the arguments I used to have with the president was that he believed that campaign tactics were for campaigns. And that once you're president, you don't need that. You don't communicate, you don't kind of have a message that you drive every day and so on, because these are serious. He believed what Mario Cuomo once said, which is you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. And that really isn't true. You need a little bit of the campaign in governing. And that was a big argument we had. But also in this new environment, I said to the group this morning, there is no bully pulpit anymore to speak of. There's this atomized bully pulpit that you have to reassemble time and again, because people are watching so many different things. They're getting information from so many different places. The White House did, I think, a good job of disseminating the substance of the president's State of the Union speech in advance through various vehicles, social media, television, the whole, and then allowing his State of the Union to be thematic. But you see, the president, I said this morning, it would have been inconceivable not of so many years ago that a president would go make his case on health care on something called Between Two Ferns. And yet he spoke to 10 million people in one day, 10 million views in one day on that appearance. So you have to be very much on the cusp, on the edge of where all of this media is going in order to communicate. And I think you can see increasingly the president. The other day I had this experience. I was on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart the day that he made the night he made his announcement, which was surreal in and of itself. The next morning I was over at NBC. Of course, the Brian Williams thing had happened. And what struck me was that the Jon Stewart story was actually the bigger of the stories, because Jon Stewart was the more impactful of the two in terms of our politics. And on that same day that all this happened, the president gave an interview to BuzzFeed, which didn't exist a few years ago. And it just speaks to how rapidly all of this is changing, and part of being president is going to be how you stay ahead of that curve and keep communicating so that you can talk to the people you need to talk to, and a broad array of people. They're not all going to be sitting around their radio like they were when FDR was president, waiting for your fireside chat. So I don't know if my answer was responsive, but...
No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Last question.
Well, many of the themes of his presidency are laid out in his second book. And so anyone who has read that has insight into his thinking in great detail.
The Audacity of Hope.
Yes. But one of the things that had not quite yet happened yet was the financial meltdown, and that was written in 2006. And so my question is about that. Does he feel, does Barack Obama or President Obama feel that he's done enough to rein in the financial institutions? And what does, another way of phrasing that might be, what sort of grade did Eric Holder get on his report card last year? Was it an A+ for not pursuing prosecutions and only imposing penalties? I really would like to know more about what Obama's feels that he's done enough or can do more between the next 2 years to rein in the shenanigans, to put it mildly, of the financial institutions that caused the meltdown.
Well, I wasn't there on report card day last year, so I don't know. But look, I think one of the best speeches that Obama ever gave, in my view, was one to NASDAQ in 2007, in which he talked about capitalism, and that we've never had unfettered capitalism. We've always had rules to keep people from taking advantage or putting their thumb on the scale in unwarranted ways. And you know, he basically warned of the impending problems, and they came to pass. His view, and he's spoken to it throughout his presidency, is still the same. We had the crisis. There was a lot of consternation about having to step in and essentially save the financial industry from some of the excesses, their own excesses. There was outrage. I shared it. I wrote about it in here about you know, companies that were the beneficiaries of help paying out huge bonuses. That was a big debate within the administration. And then we had this big battle over financial reform. One of the reasons why there weren't prosecutions, and you know, not only are there scientists in this room, but probably lawyers who may have a dissenting point of view, but one of the things that, when I raised my frustrations, one of the things I was told is that there were insufficient laws to govern what was essentially a 21st century financial system, and that was a source of frustration. And there was this before and after the crisis. The president felt we needed a 21st century set of rules. We had the Dodd-Frank bill. It's certainly not perfect because it was the most lobbied and most contested fight, you know, in a very long time. But it is a lot better than we had in terms of transparency, in terms of the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, in terms of some of the demands on banks. I know there's debate. I think Barney Frank would make a vigorous argument on the side that steps were taken that will prevent the kinds of unraveling, the too big to fail unraveling that we've seen before. Others have suggested otherwise. But it was the best bill that we could pass through Congress, and it's a lot better than what we had. You know, I'm not going to sit here and grade Holder because I don't know, I don't fully understand the restraints that he had under the law. I don't sense from him any lack of willingness to do it or enthusiasm to do it. I don't think the president lacked outrage about what happened. And so I think we created some new tools. But look, this isn't, I think this is an ongoing challenge to make sure that we have transparency in the financial markets, that people aren't being taken advantage of, that we don't have the kind of excesses we saw, and that 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 not as a punitive matter, but if people are making vast sums of money and we have needs as a country, that some of that money be dedicated to solving the needs of that country. I think all of those things are moving forward. Whether we get it some of them through this Congress, I think, is a big problem. But so I think we had to right the country in the midst of the crisis. We tried to remedy some of the problems we saw through the financial reform, and I think we're better off now than we were before. But I'm not willing to say that all that work is done, and I think that's about. It may not be a satisfying answer, but it's the best answer that I can give you. I can see it's not a satisfying answer. You're not sitting down.
I'm a scientist, not a lawyer, so don't worry.
I'm sorry?
I'm a scientist, not a lawyer, so
oh, I see.
no worries.
All right. Well, maybe we can get a lawyer up here to answer that science question.
Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much.
This has been a long evening. Thank you. Thank you very much, David. And Deval Patrick, thank you. Thank you, sir.